celebrate the incredible people of Carlisle who came together to support their friends and neighbours at that time, and one group in particular who went on to form the North Cumbria Search and Rescue Team, whose work continues to be funded entirely by donations to this day. So can I invite the Leader of the House to thank North Cumbria Search and Rescue for their continued work to keep the communities across North Cumbria safe.
Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this important anniversary. I remember very well the terrible events, but also give us the opportunity to pay tribute to the fantastic people of Carlisle across the communities in the way that they have responded to the challenges of the flooding. And I will join with my honourable friend in celebrating the extraordinary work of the Cumbria Search and Rescue and those who run these vital services, not just in her area, but across the UK.
Ewan Steinbank.
Speaker, I said last month during Lord's messages to the Employment Rights Bill that I have proportionate respect for the work of the other place. But the public, this House and especially young, lower-paid, insecure workers expect a popular elected government's manifesto commitments not to be held up, compromised or rejected by the other place. Therefore, will the Leader schedule an urgent debate in government time in this, the elected chamber, on whether we should now abolish the House of Lords?
Deputy Speaker, on the matter of employment rights, my honourable friend will know that the matter will return to this House before the recess, and he may wish to raise the point that he's doing. Of course, it's important that this House, as the elected House, ultimately gets its way, but on many matters, the upper house has an important role to play. We've had debates about these things in future. I'm sure the debate about not just whether we reform the House of Lords, but also whether we actually need a second chamber will continue into the future.
Andy McNay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This week, residents in Rosendale have once again been experiencing massive disruption and delays due to roadworks. This time it was emergency works by United Utilities where unnecessary four-way lights were not being operated according to the permit. My office has been working with local councils to get promises of action from Lancashire County Council, but as of this morning, there was no change. My residents are rightly fed up with this happening time and time again. Since being elected, I've been calling on the County Council to introduce to properly enforce streetworks and to introduce a lane rental scheme which could address congestion on our busiest roads. And so now, once again, I'm calling on the Reform leadership there to take urgent action on this. To shine a light on the issue, would the Leader agree to a debate in government time on the issue of streetworks?
I share my honourable friend's frustration and understand just how disruptive streetworks can be for drivers and for local communities, and it's really disappointing that the local authority has not responded positively on these matters. We are doubling fixed penalty notice for certain streetworks offences, but in the meantime I would urge the County Council to enforce the orders that my honourable friend raises. Otherwise, not least, because otherwise residents and road users may conclude that the Reform-led Council is all talk and no delivery.
And finally, John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will the Leader join me in congratulating schools and youth groups in my constituency for their phenomenal 53 engagements with UK Parliament Week? It's not a competition, but I'd like to update the House that rugby came 12th out of 650 constituencies and second in the West Midlands. I visited Ashlawn School, Rugby Free Secondary School, Corston Brownies, Binley Woods Youth Club and the Hindu Swayamsevak Sang Rugby Branch to discuss politics with the young people. English Martyrs RC Primary, Clifton upon Dunsmore C of E Primary and First Hill Morton Guards sent questions that I answered on enthusiasm for contributing to improving their community, country and world shows that democracy has a bright future, Madam Deputy Speaker. So will he join me in paying tribute to the brilliant parliamentary staff who worked so hard to ensure a very successful UK Parliament Week?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I certainly join him in thanking the parliamentary staff for the fantastic work that they do, and the leadership to Mr Speaker with regard to Parliament Week. But let me also congratulate him. 53 engagements is a huge number, and I see that he is very much wired into his local constituency and doing a fantastic job in motivating people there. It's really important that schools and clubs engage, and I want to thank each of the ones he has spoken about, but all others who've engaged. I want to thank them very much for making Parliament Week such a success. It's great that so many young people are involved and have hopefully not just a better understanding but a better interest in politics, and they may wish to take that on into involvement at local level, but who knows, we may see some of them sitting on these benches in future years.
Can I thank the Leader of the House for his responses to members this morning? Before we come to the statement, I should inform the House that the case concerned is still technically sub judice until sentencing. However, the Government has made the judgment that the House should have an opportunity to consider this matter. It raises issues of national importance and the accused has pleaded guilty. Therefore, Mr. Speaker has granted a limited waiver so that members may discuss the issues raised in the context of this case. Members should not speculate about sentencing issues. Members should also be cautious about prejudicing any ongoing investigations. We now come to a statement from the Secretary of State for Education.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and with permission, I will now make a statement regarding the sickening case of child sexual abuse at a nursery in Camden. And before I go further, I do want to remind the House that, of course, there remains a live police investigation underway and that the perpetrator is awaiting sentencing. All of us here and people across our country will wish to join with me in expressing our horror at hearing of these appalling crimes. A 45-year-old British man, Vincent Chan, pleaded guilty to 26 offences. These include multiple counts of sexual assault on a child by penetration, assault of a child by touching, and taking and making indecent photographs of a child, including Category A images depicting the most serious abuse. He was employed by a nursery setting in Camden between June 2017 and May 2024. On the 8th of September 2025, he was arrested after evidence was uncovered on devices seized in a previous police investigation. He was then charged with the 26 offences in question on the 9th of September. Madam Deputy Speaker, yesterday Vincent Chan entered a plea of guilty and sentencing will take place on the 23rd of January. In the meantime, the Metropolitan Police have met families of all of the children they have identified as victims of contact offences. In addition, the Met have written to the other families whose children attended the setting in question while the individual worked there to reassure them that where there is evidence of offences, the affected families have been contacted. Local children's social care services are providing emotional and practical support to families and signposting them to specialist support services. Madam Deputy Speaker, the NSPCC have been commissioned to set up a bespoke helpline as the first point of contact for anyone affected by these horrific acts. Details of the helpline can be found in the communications from Camden Council and the Metropolitan Police. Specialist support is available for victims. From the dedicated NSPCC helpline, people affected can be supported directly or referred to the right source of support to meet their needs. And the Government has provided funding to ensure there is sufficient capacity to support families. Following a notification of a serious incident, the Police, Integrated Care Board and the local authority have completed a rapid review to establish the facts. That means setting out a clear timeline of the events leading up to the incidents, of the incidents themselves, of the roles played by different agencies and the safety of children at the nursery at each stage. Those initial findings are now being worked through quickly, but I can confirm to the House that the rapid review has concluded that a full local child safeguarding practice review is warranted, which is being set up immediately. I am clear that this wider review must shine the strongest possible light on these horrifying incidents, and that we learn every lesson we can to make sure that crimes like this are guarded against at every step and every stage. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it is critical that local safeguarding partners can continue their investigations. But I will work closely with them, with the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, with its chair, Sir David Holmes, and with Home Office colleagues, to make absolutely sure that we have in place the most robust safeguards possible. We must do everything in our power to protect children. On that, I take my responsibilities as Secretary of State, not simply for education, but for children, with the utmost seriousness. But preventing cases such as these, Madam Deputy Speaker, needs everyone to believe and act on the fundamental principle that safeguarding is everyone's business. It is the duty of all of us, right across our society. If we see abuse, to report it. If we see or hear something that feels wrong, to question it and to challenge it. Madam Deputy Speaker, all of us owe that to our children, to do the right thing. Keeping children safe is one of the most important duties of any society. And I would like to thank our early years staff and wider children's services workforce. Those who work so hard, day in, day out, to give children of this country the best start in life. I know all committed early years and children's services professionals will be just as horrified as we all are to hear about what has taken place. Just as distressed to think that something like this could happen in a place that should have been dedicated to keeping children safe and helping them thrive. The defendant has now pleaded guilty to these sickening crimes and will be sentenced. But Madam Deputy Speaker, my thoughts this afternoon are not on him. They are with all of the child victims of these vile and abhorrent crimes and their families, who are now trying to recover from the suffering and the pain that he has caused. My promise to them, through these darkest of days, my promise to members here today, my promise to families across the country, is not only that justice will be served, but that we will strengthen the ways in which we keep children safe. We will root out abuse from wherever it hides, and we will never stop working to rid our society of this evil. And I commend this statement to the House.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And this is an utterly horrific case. I want to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement and to her officials and advisers who took a physical reaction to this news. It's just so unspeakably awful, and the betrayal of trust that has taken place is abhorrent. I know the thoughts and prayers of everyone in this place will be the families and children affected. And all of our collective efforts must now focus on how we do all we can to prevent this ever happening again. With that goal in mind, I have a number of questions about the case that I want to put to the Secretary of State, with a full understanding that much of this might be covered by this serious case review, and I'm seeking her assurances that these issues will be looked at in the future rather than expecting full answers now. The first question is about the time it took for the images and videos on the devices in question to be looked at by the police. My understanding is whilst the perpetrator was first arrested and the devices seized in June 2024, the devices were not examined and the abusive content was not found by the police until over a year later. This is obviously an unacceptably long delay, given the case involved nursery children and a man who in 2024 was barred from working with children. There clearly needs to be an expedited process for devices where children are involved, particularly those who cannot speak and advocate for themselves. And I'd be grateful if the Education Secretary would confirm she will raise this with the Home Secretary. Secondly, I understand that there was CCTV in use at the nursery, but this was wiped by the time that it took for these serious abuse offences to come to light, and so we do not have access to it. This is terrible because with the CCTV, it may have been possible to more easily identify affected children and spare the hundreds of parents the unimaginable terror that their children may have been affected. Obviously, this links to my first point about delays in accessing the devices, but given that in other nursery abuse cases, it's also taken time for offences to come to light, looking at the retention guidance around CCTV in nursery seems a sensible step, and one it would be helpful to understand if the Education Secretary is considering. Thirdly, this investigation was triggered by a member of staff at the nursery raising concerns. Can the Secretary of State confirm if these concerns were investigated immediately by the nursery, and at what stage Ofsted was notified, and the steps that Ofsted took? Is the Secretary of State content that a rigorous and timely process was followed by Ofsted? It will seem unbelievable to most people that this was able to go on under the noses of other staff and in the daytime without anyone else being aware. Can the Secretary of State confirm if other concerns were raised about Mr. Cham previously by other nursery staff or by parents? And what checks have taken place on safeguarding procedures at this nursery chain subsequent to this incident? Lastly, according to reports, the perpetrator in question had 26,000 indecent images of children, and 16 nursery devices at his home. Was it standard practice for these devices to be removed from the site? Why did nobody notice? And why was he allowed to have so many devices? Is the Education Secretary considering revised guidance around the use of devices in early years settings? Madam Deputy Speaker, I stand with the Secretary of State, officials and the police as they do all they can to seek justice for victims. And we in this House will do all we can to ensure that this never happens again.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her response. I know she shares my commitment and determination to make sure that our early years settings are safe for our children, as parents and children rightly expect them to be. Madam Deputy Speaker, she raises a number of important questions, a number of important areas related to policy. I will answer them as best I can, and she will appreciate there may be limitations on the precise nature of what I can say, but she raises important questions that will need to be considered through the work of the local review. She asks about the time it took for images to be considered. That will be considered through the local review. She is right to raise that question, and I will, of course, discuss the issue that she raises with colleagues at the Home Office where it comes to children. She also asks about the use of CCTV and devices. She is right again to do so. I would also just like to make clear that it may not have been the case that CCTV had been in operation at the nursery. That has come to light subsequently, but we will make sure that the review considers that important question. But on the wider point around the use of CCTV and devices in early years settings, some early years settings do already use CCTV, as she notes. Sadly, we know that it can never prevent entirely the prospect of abuse taking place, and there may well be differing views amongst parents and carers and the sector about CCTV use in settings. However, I appreciate there have been a number of ways in which this has been raised as a concern. Therefore, I do intend to appoint an expert advisory group to develop guidance for the sector on the safe and effective use of CCTV and digital devices. This guidance will set out best practice, technical information and clear expectations, and I will provide updates as that work progresses. The other questions that she raises are the right questions. She is completely right to raise those issues, and the local review will consider them further. She'll understand that I can't expand on many of the facts, but I do appreciate the care and sensitivity that she has shown in the approach on this issue. I know the focus of everyone in this House will be with the families today, those who are suffering because of despicable acts across the House, and the justice that they deserve. And we as a government will continue to take whatever steps to keep children safe, to root out abuse wherever it hides, and to rid this evil from our society.
Chair of the Education Select Committee, Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for her statement. Vincent Chan's crimes are utterly horrific, the most egregious breach of trust imaginable and every parent's worst nightmare. My thoughts, and I know the thoughts of the whole House, have been with the children who are the victims of Vincent Chan and their families ever since his crimes came into the public domain. Incidents such as this, and the recent case of Roxana Lecker, who was convicted of abusing children at 2 nurseries, raise serious concerns about the effectiveness of Ofsted's inspection regime for the early years, which currently rates 98% of providers as good or outstanding. So can I ask the Secretary of State what she's doing to ensure that Ofsted urgently brings forward the reform of their early years inspection framework so that it is fit for purpose? Will she review the current requirements for safeguarding training for early years practitioners and for the use of CCTV to ensure that all staff are appropriately trained and that the requirements are fit for purpose? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State's colleagues in the Home Office have decided not to implement the version of mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse recommended by Professor Alexis Jay in the ICSA report, citing the workload that it would create. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that workload should not be a consideration when it comes to the safety of children? And can I ask her to go back to her colleagues in the Home Office to urge them to rethink this decision and to implement the more robust mandatory reporting obligation set out by Professor Jay, which includes criminal sanctions for non-compliance? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State spoke about the support that is being provided quite rightly to the victims and the families who are the victims of Vincent Chan. Can she say a bit more about how support will be made available to those children and their families so that they can draw on it throughout their lives whenever they need it?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chair of the Select Committee raises questions relating to Ofsted. I know the Right Honourable Lady did so as well, and I'll respond in some detail on that. It is important that we understand what has happened here to make sure we, as far as we can, prevent this ever happening again. It is critical that the local safeguarding partners conclude their investigations, and we will work with them and with the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. But we will also work with Ofsted to review the regulation of nursery chains. Ofsted keep all settings under review and conduct visits where risk assessments deem this necessary. But the horrific crimes that we are discussing today are an important reminder that we expect providers to be vigilant across all early year settings, and it's important that settings and staff do report and act on concerns quickly as part of an open safeguarding culture. I set out to the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, my intentions around considering CCTV and the use of digital devices, and I would, as always, appreciate the input from the Select Committee and from the Chair as we take that work forward. Around the wider need to make reforms in child protection and children's safeguarding matters, on the 9th of April, the Government published a progress update to address the recommendations from ICSA, including the establishment of a Child Protection Authority to provide stronger national oversight of child protection. We'll be launching consultation shortly on how we take this forward, and I will continue to discuss all of the related matters with colleagues at the Home Office.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Munira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement and for the briefing that officials provided to me. The details of this case are harrowing and deeply disturbing. My first thoughts are with the families affected, and I sincerely hope they're getting all the support and care they need. Sadly, however, this latest heinous case is part of a distressing pattern that is emerging in earlier settings across the country, where safeguarding practices have not been followed or are proving insufficient to prevent babies and young children coming to harm. Less than 3 months ago, Roxana Lecker was jailed for 8 years on 21 counts of child cruelty when she worked at Riverside Nursery, Twickenham Green, in my constituency. And just last year, another nursery worker was jailed for manslaughter following the tragic death of Gigi Mihan in Cheadle. BBC Panorama exposed a worrying level of abuse and neglect in nurseries across the country. So while she's rightly said that lessons will be learned from the Camden case, it is clear that we already urgently need to strengthen safeguard in earlier settings. The Safeguarding Panel review in the Twickenham Green case and the parents of the children affected have set out clearly 3 broad areas for change. Transparency around who is working in our earlier settings, what qualifications and what training they've had, and their history and vetting. What consideration has the Secretary of State given to looking at an early years practitioner register Australia, as Australia has recently proposed? Secondly, monitoring. In the Twickenham Green and Gigi Mihan cases, CCTV was vital in securing convictions and might have caught Chan sooner, and I welcome her announcement today. But will the Secretary of State would now seriously consider mandating CCTV in nurseries with a requirement for management to regularly review footage and Ofsted to routinely check footage at inspections? And thirdly, accountability. The Vincent Chan and Twickenham Green cases involved nursery chains. Will the Secretary of State set out a timeline for when Ofsted will start corporate inspections of nursery chains and ensure that when serious safeguarding issues are found in one setting, inspections are triggered across the chain? Madam Deputy Speaker, no parent should have to worry about that their child is safe when they head off to work, but our most vulnerable are repeatedly being let down. She rightly said keeping children safe is one of the most important duties in our society. Ministers urgently need to act to do so, and we stand ready to work with them.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady and for her engagement with officials in discussing these matters. It's an area where I believe we'll be most effective if we can work across the House in addressing the very serious concerns that have been raised here, but also in a number of other cases to which she makes reference. around the use of CCTV and whether it ought to be mandatory in use in early years settings. That will be an area that I would ask the expert advisory group to consider when they look at guidance. There are differing views across the sector and amongst parents and carers, because whilst there could clearly be benefits associated with the use of CCTV, others have raised concerns about the potential for misuse of such recordings, and we need to ensure that any guidance or changes are brought forward in line with the evidence to make sure that it leads to appropriate use of CCTV in settings and appropriate use of devices in settings. In terms of the role of Ofsted, Madam Deputy Speaker, from next April, Ofsted will inspect new early years providers within 18 months of opening and move towards inspecting all providers at least once every 4 years compared to 6 years previously. Ofsted will receive additional funding to enhance the quality of inspection by strengthening quality assurance processes and providing targeted training for inspectors. We are working with Ofsted to introduce reporting on larger nursery chains, so issues that span a group of providers can be addressed. And Ofsted will always continue to keep all settings under review to make sure that visits take place when risk assessments deem this necessary. And now, as the local review does its work, which will take place led by an independent reviewer, a reviewer independent of the local authority and local safeguarding partners, we will of course consider any recommendations that come forward through that work that have wider implications in terms of the sector and in children's safeguarding. And I will of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, continue to keep members updated on progress.
Sadiq.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Secretary of State for Education for her statement and for reassuring us that this case has been given the importance and urgency that it deserves. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is every parent's worst nightmare, and I want to pay tribute to my constituents and the brave parents who are here today to watch the proceedings, not just because they want justice for their own children, but because they want to make sure that never again are children put in this situation. There are a number of requests from the parents in my constituency, and I recognise the Secretary of State won't be able to answer all of them, but I would be grateful if she could write to me on whether she has considered enhanced background checks for everyone working with children, enabling the use of safeguarding CCTVs in nurseries and early years providings, a mandatory 2-adult supervision rule for all nurseries and childcare practices. Is she looking into expanding Ofsted ratings to include a clear assessment of nurseries' digital device policies and controls? Is she looking into establishing an independent state-run safeguarding reporting body that parents can approach directly when concerns are raised, as there was in this particular nursery? And such a body must be fully resourced to investigate childcare providers without reliance on internal nursery procedures. And finally, could I ask the Secretary of State, will she ask the Prime Minister if the Prime Minister will meet with me and affected parents to discuss not just this particular case, but to discuss how we strengthen the safeguarding process and the accountability of large childcare providers in our country?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I join with her in paying tribute to the families for their bravery, for their courage, and I cannot begin to imagine the trauma and pain that they are experiencing as a result of these heinous crimes. And I'm pleased that my honourable friend is such a powerful champion and voice for children and families, both in her community and for children and families across our country. She raises a number of important questions. I will, of course, respond to her fully in writing to the best of my ability, given some of the limitations that we are continuing to operate under in this case. But I can give her the assurance that the Prime Minister would be happy to meet with the families affected. And we will also, at that meeting, be able to discuss further many of the questions that they have, many of the questions that she has rightly raised on their behalf today in this House.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, this is appalling, and it's quite right that the thoughts of all of us are with the families affected, and the government does everything it can to mitigate cases like this from recurring in future. Can the Secretary of State tell the House when she expects the findings of the review to come forward, and what additional steps the government is looking at in order to ensure that parents and anyone with safeguarding concerns can report them much more easily?
The local review will get underway immediately. It will be led by an independent reviewer, someone who is independent of the local safeguarding partnership, and from the point at which the independent reviewer takes post, there will be 6 months for that report to come forward. But the chair of the national panel will keep in close contact with the local reviewer during this time to track progress and any emerging challenges or issues, and which will of course be shared with the Department for Education if that is necessary. He is right to highlight that safeguarding is a responsibility for all of us, to challenge, to question, to report what we see, and that's why the reforms that we will set out in response to Alexis Jay's review through the Child Protection Authority will be an important means by which we can do that. But all of us have to be ever vigilant, willing to challenge and question, but also to believe children where they are able to speak and tell us what they have experienced. Take that seriously, act upon their concerns. This is a responsibility not just for staff in early years settings, it is a responsibility for all of us right across society.
Sam Carling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This awful case underlies how important it is that we implement the recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse as soon as possible. But as my honourable friend, the member for Dulwich and West Norwood, has set out, the Home Office has set out plans not to implement the ICS recommendation on mandatory reporting in full. I spoke at report stage of the Crime and Policing Bill to set out why this will leave children vulnerable. Will the Secretary of State ask the relevant minister from her department to meet me to discuss these concerns in more detail and find a solution?
I understand the concerns that my honourable friend raises and the importance of making sure that we have the strongest possible protections for all children to keep them safe from harm. It's why we did provide a progress update rising out of the recommendations from ICSA, including the establishment of a Child Protection Authority, and we'll be setting out more shortly, including launching a consultation on how we take this forward. But I would, of course, speak to colleagues in the Home Office to make sure that my honourable friend has the meeting that he requests to discuss this further.
Caroline Bowden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I just start by saying that I echo the comments of the Secretary of State and all members that my thoughts are with the families affected by this awful case. There is a concerning lack of accountability once a setting shuts down, even if it is part of a chain, and currently there is no mechanism to ensure that chain providers have corporate responsibility when harm occurs. So how will the Minister address this? And if a setting is closed down and deregistered from Ofsted, what assurances can she give parents that individual staff members are further checked and vetted before they go on to work elsewhere? Thank you.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. We are, as a department, working with Ofsted to review the regulation of nursery chains to make sure that parents can see strengths and areas of concern across the chain and where appropriate action can be taken. I recognise the additional questions she asks about the nature of regulation and the importance of preventing rules from being exploited. I will make sure that she receives a full response from Ofsted, setting out their approach and any changes that they are considering to respond to the questions that she asks.
Jen Craft.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this appalling case, I think all of our thoughts are with the families of those children affected, and I don't think we can even begin to understand the impact that that will have on those children throughout their lives, and there will be a whole load of support that will need to be brought in to protect them and actually deal with the knock-on effects that they will be experiencing. I am brought to mind of a case that's been brought to my attention with another group of extremely vulnerable individuals, and these are older children but with complex and severe learning disabilities. A parallel, I can't talk too much about it because it's a live case, but a parallel that struck me was where serious safeguarding concerns have been identified and given weight in one setting when that organisation is part of, in this case, a larger chain of nurseries. In the case where I am, a multi-academy trust, it does raise questions as to whether that body can be trusted with safeguarding more widely, and are there plans in place to look at that corporate responsibility and to, rather than just see it as an individual isolated incident, to look across the piece. And as a similar parallel, I understand that it was a whistleblower that brought this case to the attention of the police in the first place. And I would just like to know what measures will be introduced to protect whistleblowers in cases such as these, particularly when the person and the organisation to whom the whistleblower is reporting may be compromised.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and she raises a number of important concerns around where groups can operate both either in early years settings or schools, and the importance of making sure that we have the right framework in place to take action where that is necessary. This is something that We are taking an active approach on both in early years and also in schools, working with Ofsted on these key points. I recognise the limitations in what she is able to say in the Chamber today about the case that she mentions, but I, of course, or my honourable friend, the Minister, would be willing to meet with her to discuss further her concerns in this area and what more we can do to make sure that we keep all children safe from harm. She raises the question of whistleblowing. I won't comment on the case in particular here, given the local review is underway, but of course whistleblowers do continue to enjoy protection under the law in the action that they take to protect others from harm, and of course through the progress against Alexis J's review we will be taking further action around mandatory reporting as we've discussed today.
Mark Pritchard.
The whole House's thoughts are with the victims and the victims' families, but would the Education like to join me in praising the Metropolitan Police team that brought this case to charge, and in particular Detective Superintendent Lewis Basford and his team, and of course the CPS. It must have been harrowing for them to investigate it and bring it to charge. But more generally, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's an estimated 500,000 sexually abused children in this country every year. And according to the National Crime Agency, 840,000 individuals are currently posing a sexual risk to children. And there are, shockingly, 400,000 searches a month in this country for child sexual abuse images. Clearly, this country, while still safer than many, has a problem. And that problem often starts online. So what more can the government do to ensure that the owners of tech companies, not just the managers, are held to account when they're not taking action against the downloading of such images and viewing, and what more the government can do. And just more generally, she mentions the Child Protection Authority that might be coming forward. Can I just encourage her not to move away from the great work that the National Crime Agency is doing? It's done a lot more in this area over recent years, had a lot of success. It has the resources, has the manpower, it has technology, and I just wouldn't want their excellent work to be overshadowed by any new authority. And given that local police forces don't have the resources and are overstretched already, what more can be done at a national level to coordinate across the police forces in England, Wales, in particular West Mercia, my own area, with the National Crime Agency, in order that we can see a reduction in this viewing?
Secretary of State. The Honourable Gentleman raises a number of important points, and he is right to thank the police for their thorough work in what has been a complex, extremely complex and harrowing investigation. And I want to pay tribute to all of those who've been involved to this point in supporting the victims and the families, and those who will be involved in taking forward further work in this area. He is also right to draw attention to the scale of child sexual abuse that we still sadly see in our country. Before I came to this House, I worked with many of those who had been affected by child sexual abuse. I understand the lifelong impact it can have on many, many people. I understand also that for a very long time we have not been serious enough as a society in encouraging those who have experienced appalling abuse, including in childhood, to seek the support that they need and the advice that they will need, often for many, many years into the future. And a key issue that we've often faced in that regard has been the fact that where children have come forward to report abuse, they haven't always been believed by those in positions of authority, and that has to change, which is why the culture shift that is required is as important as any legislative measures that we need to take, so that children are believed when they report abuse and that action follows, and that those in positions of authority where they fail to do so face consequences for their actions and their failure to take forward allegations by children and others. He also references the appalling scale of what we see online. We will continue to work with Home Office colleagues on this issue, and of course I will look carefully at what he said around the development of the Child Protection Authority. We will be setting out more details to the House in due course and to update members in this area, alongside a consultation that will allow views to be aired about the best way forward in setting this out.
Jazz Aswell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for Education for the statement and the urgency and the respect she has shown this particular case. And can I put it on record that I agree with the sentiments of this House and the urgency that we need to deal with this particular case and potential cases in the future that we must stop. Madam Deputy Speaker, the police have to be commended, but before that, the trigger point, which was started by the whistleblower, also, that's where it started. We have to look at two things, because the pain that is being suffered by the parents is unimaginable, and the trauma of other children will be felt for years and generations to come. Can the Secretary of State assure me that the unregistered, unregulated settings are also looked at very quickly, and the lessons learned from this particular case is shared amongst all the settings across the entire country, so everybody learns the lessons, not just this particular setting or chain?
I agree very strongly with my honourable friend, and alongside what he has set out, of course, we are, in bringing forward the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, we are taking a number of important steps to improve safeguarding. And the bill brings forward bold new measures to keep children safe, including a legal obligation for safeguarding partners to work hand in hand with education and childcare settings, because we know it's often teachers and early years staff who first see the signs of abuse and neglect. And that runs alongside the establishment of a Child Protection Authority, a new national body, which will have expertise, authority and a single mission to protect children. And through that work and through the development of the Child Protection Authority, we will be in a stronger position to make sure that where there are lessons to learn in individual cases, that is shared and spread much more widely, so that we can keep children safe from harm.
Final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for her clear commitment, reassuring and encouraging commitment to take the steps that are necessary, that everybody in this House wants, and everybody out there who's a parent or who looks at this case, they want it as well. And just to say that it's inconceivable, Madam Deputy Speaker, to try and comprehend what has happened. I just can't take it in. But our thoughts are very much with the parents and the children at this time. This is a devastating case and will be a prolonged impact on all children and parents involved. So I'm very pleased that the person involved has pleaded guilty and is due to be sentenced, and hopefully a strict punishment. What lesson can be learned from this case in relation to whistleblowing, and to ensure that staff and colleagues feel safe enough to report anything unusual without the fear of not being protected, as the case was really only ever discovered due to minor concerns, which turned out to be much, much more.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. The local review, which will come forward shortly, will give us the position to consider what lessons there are from this case, but also what wider questions require a policy response, either from government or from others, about how we can do more to keep children safe. It's right they do their work thoroughly and carefully, as we would expect. But there is, of course, the ongoing need to make sure that all settings are as safe as possible for our children. And as part of that work, particularly around early years settings, we strengthened the requirements in September 2025 and introduced a wide range of strengthened safeguarding measures to the early years foundation stage, and that does include enhanced recruitment practices to prevent further unsuitable individuals from working with children, and new whistleblowing requirements alongside that to help ensure that all early years educators understand how to escalate any safeguarding concerns that they have.
That is the end of the statement on the Camden Nursery sexual abuse case. I'll allow the front benches a few moments to shuffle over before we move on to our second statement. If members can settle down, we can start the Home Office statement on the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry, and I call the Minister Dan Jarvis.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement on the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry, which has today published its report. I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, with Dawn Sturgess. The untimely and sudden death of a much-missed mother, partner, daughter, sister and friend is a deeply personal tragedy. And today we keep her and her loved ones in our thoughts and in our prayers. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 4th of March 2018, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, were targeted by the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Services. 3 GRU agents flew to the UK intent on killing Sergei Skripal. 2 agents, known as Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Basharov, travelled to Salisbury and contaminated the door handle of Sergei's house with the nerve agent Novichok, with callous and despicable disregard for others who might enter or leave that address. Sergei and Yulia were poisoned and spent weeks in a critical condition. Others, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, were harmed as they responded to the incident. Then, on the 30th of June 2018, Charlie Rowley gave his partner Dawn Sturgess a gift of a Nina Ricci perfume bottle. She sprayed her wrists with the contents. Tragically, the bottle contained Novichok and had been recklessly thrown away by Petrov and Bashirov as they left Salisbury 4 months earlier. Dawn died at Salisbury Hospital on the 8th of July 2018. An inquest was opened. However, it was clear that a proper examination of Dawn Sturgess's death would require a statutory public inquiry, which has been chaired by Lord Hughes. Today, after an extensive and painstaking process, the inquiry has published its report. The inquiry has found that those who were involved in the assassination attempt against Sergei Skripal were morally responsible for Dawn's death, and that deploying a highly toxic nerve agent in a busy city was an astonishingly reckless act. The Chair concludes that the operation must have been signed off at the highest level of the Russian state, including President Putin. Now, in respect to the emergency services treatment of Dawn, the inquiry found that she received entirely appropriate medical care, but that tragically her condition was unsurvivable. In terms of preventability, the Chair has concluded that the government's public health advice following the attack on the Skripals was reasonable. He also found that although there were failings in the management of Sergei Skripal, the risk of assassination by Russian personnel was reasonably assessed, and based on that assessment, he did not need a new identity. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the inquiry has been clear in its findings of responsibility, and we must respond equally unequivocally. Now, I've described the acute threat that Russia poses to the UK and to our national security to honourable members in the House previously. Its recent acts have ranged from murdering Alexander Litvinenko, using a deadly nerve agent in Salisbury, espionage, arson, cyber attacks, and the targeting of UK parliamentarians for interference operations. Since 2018, the UK has been at the forefront of the response against Russia. In direct response to the poisonings, the then government expelled 23 Russian undeclared intelligence officers. This triggered the expulsion of over 150 Russian diplomats by 28 countries, including NATO allies. The UK has subsequently committed to prevent the rebuild of Russian intelligence and to remove Russian dirty money in the UK, developed legislative powers to harden the UK's defences against state threats, and delivered new port and border powers, increased security checks on goods from Russia, and banned Russian-owned or linked aircraft from entering the UK. The invasion of Ukraine introduced a stark new reality and demonstrated Russia's intent to undermine European security as well as global security. The UK has led the way, standing by Ukraine and providing unprecedented military, humanitarian and diplomatic support. In total, the UK has committed £21.8 billion for Ukraine and has sanctioned over 2,900 individuals, entities and ships. This government is proud to be at the forefront of the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine in defending its sovereignty and security. Now, this has inevitably made the UK a target for increased hostile activity by Russia. Following an arson attack in East London in May of 2024, the then Home Secretary warned of a pattern of Russian malign activities across Europe which had reached UK soil. In response, the UK expelled the Russian defence attaché and removed diplomatic status from Russian properties believed to have been used for intelligence purposes. We are determined that the UK remains a hard operating environment for the Russian intelligence services. In October last year, we sanctioned 3 Russian agencies and 3 senior figures who were attempting to undermine and destabilise Ukraine and its democracy. And in July, the UK sanctioned and exposed 3 GRU units and 18 of their military intelligence officers for the targeting of Yulia Skripal and cyber operations in support of Putin's illegal war in the Ukraine. Yet we are now grappling with an increasingly reckless methodology. The Director General of MI5 recently highlighted Russian state actors turning to proxies for their dirty work, recruiting disposable individuals on social media platforms, instructing them via encrypted apps, and then offering payment in cryptocurrencies. UK law enforcement has secured convictions in several significant cases just this year. 6 individuals spying for Russia, 6 men involved in an arson attack on a warehouse supplying Ukraine, an individual who attempted to offer services to Russian intelligence, and a former MEP who accepted bribes to promote pro-Russian narratives in the EU Parliament. These cases serve as a strong reminder for anyone seeking to facilitate or undertake hostile state activity for Russia on UK soil. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government remains committed to providing our law enforcement partners with the tools that they need to tackle these threats. We've specified Russia on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme to make it even more challenging to conceal relationships with the Russian state. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I can now announce that the government is going further. Today, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has imposed a further cost on the Russian regime by sanctioning the GRU under the Russia sanctions regime, along with several associated individuals. These sanctions recognise the continued reckless and destabilising activity of the GRU, which seeks to undermine Ukraine, European security and the safety of the United Kingdom. They will include sanctions against 8 GRU officers under the cyber sanctions regime and 3 GRU officers under the Russia sanctions regime who have been implicated in hostile activity across Europe. We are also summoning the Russian ambassador to hold Russia to account for its responsibility for the tragic death of a British citizen. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's also been extensive misinformation and disinformation relating to these horrific and barbaric poisonings. This inquiry has categorically rejected those falsehoods, and this government continues to reject the lies spread by Russia through its propaganda and through its paid mouthpieces. I wish to wholeheartedly, I'm sure on behalf of the whole House, thank Lord Hughes and his team. This was a considerable task of great importance, and they have collectively approached it with diligence, care and sensitivity. I also want to take, I'm sure on behalf of the whole House, the opportunity to thank the first responders, military personnel, the scientists, the medical practitioners and all of those responsible for responding to the attack. They are the very best of us, and I know that members right across the House will join me today in paying tribute to them for the important work that they do to keep us safe. Madam Deputy Speaker, Dawn Sturgess was the victim of an utterly reckless and dangerous act, a chemical weapons attack perpetrated by Russia on British soil. The pain and suffering it has caused can never be underdone. But we must honour Dawn Sturgess's memory, uphold truth and justice, and keep everyone in our country safe. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, let me start by thanking the Security Minister for advance sight of his statement and setting out straight away
that the opposition, of course, fully support the government's work in keeping our country safe. And I think I agree with and support everything the Security Minister said in his statement just a moment ago. I particularly welcome the additional sanctions that he announced in relation to certain members of the Russian security services. I also join with the Security Minister in remembering Dawn Sturgess, who lost her life as a result of this reckless and barbaric attack, leaving highly dangerous chemical weapons lying around was a reckless undertaking by those Russian agents, and Dawn Sturgess's death lies squarely at their door. I also pay tribute to Sergei and Yulia Skripal for the bravery they have shown when faced with targeting by agents of the Russian state who came to this country specifically with the purpose in mind of killing them. I also pay tribute to the emergency services and security services, as the Security Minister did, who responded so bravely, and some of whom, like Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, themselves were harmed as they responded to this attack. The emergency services and security services on that day and in the days following, I think, distinguished themselves greatly, and I know the whole House will want to thank them for the work they did. Now, the chair of the inquiry concluded, as the Security Minister said, that this operation would have been signed off, would have been agreed to, at the very highest level of the Russian state by President. That Russia is a dangerous and a hostile state, and that Vladimir Putin is a dangerous and hostile leader, a man who this inquiry has found personally sanctioned the assassination of civilians on British soil. And of course, the atrocities that the Russian state and President Vladimir Putin perpetrate are not confined to those we've discussed today. We've seen on their own soil the Russian state murder domestic political opponents like Alexei Navalny. We've seen them shoot down civilian airliners. We have seen them interfere across Africa. And we have seen Putin support former President Assad of Syria in persecuting civilians in Syria, including supporting the use of chemical weapons. So we should be in no doubt at all about the threat that Russia and President Putin pose, not just on our soil, not just in Russia or in Ukraine, but across the whole world. And I think there is a lesson there for the way that we in the West collectively consider security are one of many reasons why we in the West should be steadfast and unwavering in our support for Ukraine. The lessons of history are quite clear. Appeasement doesn't work. Showing weakness when faced with an aggressive dictator simply emboldens them. And I hope those people in our government and other governments, particularly the American administration, keep that in mind as they conduct negotiations in the coming days and weeks. Now, I know the Security Minister will not be able, quite rightly, to be able to comment on details, but I know the House will appreciate an update and assurances about the work being done to protect us domestically against Russian threats. He didn't mention in his speech cyber threats, and we know, of course, that Russia actively and repeatedly, he did mention it, I do apologise, he did mention it, Russia repeatedly and deliberately target both governmental infrastructure and private sector IT infrastructure. And an update on the work he is leading to counter that would be welcome so far as he is able to, and whether he can give any indication as to whether we are proactively engaged in degrading Russia's capability in that area. I appreciate there are severe limitations around what he can say, but any indication he can provide to the House, I think, would be very much appreciated. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the lessons which we can draw from this episode relate not just to Russia, but relate to any state where we have intelligence or information that they are engaged in aggressive, hostile acts. And we know, of course, that it's not just Russia. Other states, including China, are engaged in different but potentially equally damaging espionage and other activity on our soil. And the lesson that this episode, I think, teaches us is that we can't be complacent. We can't prioritise, for example, economic links above national security. We need to be on the front foot when it comes to these threats. And in that spirit, and drawing that lesson from this episode, perhaps the Security Minister can explain to the House why China is not in the enhanced tier of FIRS, which, in my opinion, it should be, and why the government appears to be contemplating granting planning consent for a super embassy for China on a very sensitive site close to sensitive communications infrastructure, and from which it is very likely China will conduct large-scale espionage activities. The lesson this episode teaches us is that we can't be complacent and we must be active and energetic in protecting our national interest. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, in general terms, I fully support the direction of travel the Security Minister has set out, and of course the opposition will support him personally and the government in the work they're doing to keep our country safe.
Dan Jarvis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Shadow Home Secretary for his response and the tone of it? I'm very grateful for it. I think he will have noted from my opening remarks that the gravity and the seriousness with which I attach to the matter at hand, and I know that he and Right Honourable and Honourable members opposite will have noted that in my opening statement I spoke seamlessly about the work done by the previous government and this one, because I believe that standing against Russia and the threat that they pose to our national security should be and is a shared endeavour across this House. And I pay tribute to the work that the previous government did at the time of 2018 and beyond that in standing against the threat that we face. And wherever possible, we should work closely together on it. I thought the Shadow Home Secretary very accurately characterised the nature of the threat. I agree with what he said with regard to Russia and with regard to Putin, and it is impossible to overstate the seriousness of this attack and other activity that he characterised. He spoke about Ukraine, and I'm grateful to him for doing so. And again, I do want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to the previous government for the commitment that they made to defending Ukraine. I think it should be a matter of great pride across this House that perhaps above almost everything else, it is something that binds this House together. There is a unity of purpose amongst us all in ensuring that we stand together to support Ukraine in their fight against Russia. And I give him and the House an absolute commitment that we will continue the work of the previous government. Genuinely, I was really pleased that he asked about cyber, because cyber is something that I am particularly keen to ensure that we coordinate our activity across government as effectively as we possibly can. In truth, it was one of the reasons why the Prime Minister made the machinery of government change back in September to ensure that the Security Minister now sits across both departments, the Home Office and the Cabinet Office, so that I can more effectively coordinate that work. He will know that the government introduced the Cyber Resilience Bill just a couple of weeks ago, and from a Home Office perspective, we are working hard on the ransomware proposals that we consulted on earlier in this year. He was right to make the important point about the work that we do with regard to positively degrading the nature of the threats that he described. He knows that I'm very limited in terms of what I can say about that, but I know that he will join with me in paying tribute to the very important work that the National Cyber Force do. It didn't come as a huge surprise, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Shadow Home Secretary, and in truth I don't blame him for doing so, took the opportunity to raise the issue of China. I hope he's had the chance to look at what I said this morning at Cabinet Office oral questions and what I said in response to an urgent question from my honourable friend yesterday with regard to the government's position on China. I hope he's taken the opportunity to look precisely at what I said about the embassy. With regard to FIRS, I completely understand the points that he has made. The government continues to keep this under very close review, and I hope that we'll have more to say about it in due course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My thoughts are also with the family of Dawn Sturgess. In 2010, Putin said, and I quote, "Traitors would kick the bucket, believe me." Post-Litvinenko, how can it be our country can afford protection for, say, a former Prime Minister such as Liz Truss, but not for an asset such as Sergei Skripal. Yesterday's story in the Iron newspaper underlines the issue about Russian agents infiltrating into our society, and the points that the Minister makes across the board are so well put. But given Putin has no concern, as we've heard, for life, least of all in his own country, can the Minister confirm that he is working with all departments across government to assure the British public of their safety and their security?
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, I'm grateful to him for his contribution and the work that he does chairing his committee. The quote he described is chilling, and in response to the point that he made yesterday about the coverage in the Iron newspaper, I can give him the assurances that he seeks and tell him and the House that we take all national security threats incredibly seriously. This government has acted decisively by introducing tougher legislation, enforcing sanctions and working closely with our international partners to make the UK one of the most challenging environments for our adversaries to operate in. That continues to be an absolute priority in terms of securing our national security, and I am absolutely determined to ensure that the United Kingdom is the hardest possible target for our adversaries.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson Will Forster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to thank the Security Minister for speaking for the whole House when he gave our sincere condolences to Dawn Sturgess' family, when he paid tribute to the emergency and security services, but also when he gave his thoughts for those affected in the Novichok attack. Madam Deputy Speaker, a government's primary role is to keep our country safe. This report into the tragic killing of Dawn Sturgess on the streets of UK by Russian agents in their attempt to assassinate Sergei Skripal is damning. The report has found Vladimir Putin was responsible for a death of an innocent British citizen on our shores. Basic protections were not in place. Sergei was a clear target from Russian state assassins. The inquiry states that he was resettled in the UK under his own name. Russia used this to track him down, and MI5 failed to rename him. Can the Minister confirm to the House why the security services left him in an alarmingly accessible situation, despite clearly being an identified target of Russian state assassination, including residing in Salisbury in his own name? How has the security services justified to the Minister their apparent failure to implement even basic protective measures, such as CCTV, alarms or secure accommodation? Worryingly for UK security, Putin's assassins had no trouble locating him. That failure put him at risk, but exposed the wider public in Salisbury and across the country. That contributed to the death of Dawn, an entirely innocent member of the public. Last year, the Sturgess family's legal team described the Skripals as sitting ducks due to failings that should have been foreseen by MI5. Given the preventable deaths and public risk, what accountability measures will the government take to ensure MI5 protects both vulnerable individuals and the wider public? Considering the threat Russia poses to world security, especially security at home, will the government finally seize the £30 billion in Russian frozen assets across the UK, including Sutton Place in my constituency of Woking? And finally, the government needs to see this report as a turning point for the threat Russia poses to the UK. Will they launch an investigation into Russian interference in British politics to ensure no more UK politicians, like the former leader of the Reform Party in Wales, will be bribed with Russian money?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, let me say at the outset that he's absolutely right about the importance of keeping our country safe, and I give him an assurance that we take that incredibly seriously. Of course, we will look very carefully at the detail of this report. He asked me about the accountability mechanisms that exist in government, and I can give him an assurance that the Home Secretary and I take our responsibilities to hold the security services to account very, very seriously indeed. And that is a process that the new Home Secretary and myself dedicate a significant amount of time to every single week. But I do think that we have to be crystal clear that the inquiry's report states unequivocally that the responsibility lies with the Russian state. The chair of the report found that the operation to assassinate Sergei Skripal was authorised at the highest level and concluded that it would not have taken place without the approval of President Putin. The use of a military-grade nerve agent on British soil was a violation of international law and a truly despicable act. And the responsibility for that lies with Russia and Russia alone. Now, he entirely reasonably asked me about the seizing, the confiscation of sovereign Russian assets. I can give him assurance that we take that incredibly seriously as well. Our priority is to ensure that all of the options that we consider with regard to that particular matter are in line with international law and are economically and financially responsible. But Russia must be held accountable for the terrible damage that they've done in Ukraine, and we will do whatever we can to make sure that they are held accountable and that they are made to pay for their actions. His final point was an important one and was about the interference by Russia in our democracy. I chair the Defending Democracy Task Force, which has recently had its mandate renewed by the Prime Minister. These are matters that we take incredibly seriously. We use the task force as the fulcrum point across government to ensure that we have a whole-of-system response that draws together both government departments and law enforcement, and I give him an assurance of the priority that we attach to that work. But it is something that I believe should be a cross-party endeavour. So if the Honourable Member or if other members of this House wish to discuss it with me further, I'd always be very happy to do that.
Meyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The day a British citizen died on British soil as a result of a Russian attack ought to have been a wake-up call for everyone in this country, and I recognise the steps the previous government took and this one is taking to address that threat. The reality is Russian planes and ships menace our airs and waters. Their cyber attacks have hit our NHS and councils, including Redcar and Cleveland's, and their propaganda has been disseminated by British politicians and online as well. And so will the Security Minister agree with me that where the British public are concerned, this is not a distant threat elsewhere in the world, it is here now affecting them today? And can I push him specifically on the point around social media disinformation and what steps he can take working with DCIT to address it in this country?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right about the threat. It isn't a distant matter. It is one that quite literally impacts on the lives of our citizens every single day. I give him an assurance of how seriously we take these matters, but he's also, I think, right to raise the issue of mis- and disinformation. Again, through the Defending Democracy Task Force, these are matters that we keep under very close review. He's right to mention the important contribution that is required of DCIT, work very closely with DCIT and with other government departments on these matters. We keep a constant vigilance. I think that there is more, in truth, that we need to do, and I'll be having further conversations with my ministerial colleagues about that particular matter.
Honourable Member of Parliament for Salisbury, John Glenn.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Security Minister for early sight of his statement, and can I thank him most warmly for the way that he has presented the government's response this afternoon. As someone who has spent previous life in Salisbury and South Wiltshire, I think he has served the people of my constituency very well, and I'm very pleased also with the remarks of the Shadow Home Secretary. This report today was written as a consequence of the need to bring clarity, to understand unequivocally who was responsible for what happened in 2018. But I think it's important to remember the huge impact it had on Salisbury, and obviously the tragedy that befell Dawn Sturgess, Charlie Rowley, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, and Julian Sergei Skripal. This report is very clear about where responsibility and culpability lies. It lies with President Putin. Russia was responsible, and Putin as an individual was responsible. He personally ordered what happened in Salisbury, and we should never forget it. Putin is a ruthless dictator, not someone deals can be done with. And contrary to one of the candidates in the general election last year in Salisbury who said, I admire him as a political operator, I do not. I never will. I welcome what the Minister has said with respect to additional sanctions, and I would encourage him and his successors to always pursue energetically, with continued vigilance, further necessary measures as required. I welcome what he said about more sophisticated threats emerging on cyber, and I would urge him to extend that to look at what happens with our cloud infrastructure. I just have one question, if I may. Point 6.25 in the report refers to the issue of regular written assessments that were lacking in terms of the ongoing care, if you like, of Sergei Skripal. I think that is the only element that needs serious review for individuals like him in future. But can I finish by thanking the Minister again for the way he has spoken today, which will give huge comfort to my constituents in Salisbury and to the families of those so tragically affected.
Jarvis.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend the Right Honourable Gentleman for the dignified and diligent way in which he represented his constituency at the time, and for his service since and again today. I know it will be hugely appreciated across the House and certainly in the great city of Salisbury and across the wider great county of Wiltshire. And he's absolutely right in what he said today. Responsibility for this dreadful attack rests at the top of the Russian regime with President Putin. I give him the assurance that he seeks that this government, and I am sure, certainly hope, any successor governments or ministers will be incredibly vigilant, and we will pursue whatever measures are required. And I've noted the point he made about the cloud, which I think is a good one. In terms of the specific point he made with regard to the regular written assessments, I will take that one away and look closely at it. But again, can I commend him for his service to the great city of Salisbury?
Sean Woodcock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for his statement and pleased to hear of further sanctions. In his statement, he stated that Dawn Sturgess was the victim of an utterly reckless and dangerous act. I would go further and call it a heinous crime, and which responsibility lies with Vladimir Putin among many other such crimes that he is responsible for. But in his statement, he also talked about we must honour Dawn Sturgess' memory. And my question to the Minister, or my plea to the Minister rather, would be that we do that by never allowing Vladimir Putin to escape responsibility or accountability for the crime that was perpetrated in Salisbury on that day.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I completely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and I think he put it very well. The greatest legacy, as well as, of course, remembering the tragic loss of life in this case, would be to ensure that our collective defences as a country are tightened to the extent that such an attack could never happen again. Of course, the Russian regime will be constantly testing our defences, and of course we will have to remain incredibly vigilant. And of course it is the responsibility of government to ensure that we've got the appropriate levels of resource and that the United Kingdom is the hardest possible operating environment for Russia and its proxies. But he's right to remind us of where responsibility for this heinous act lies. It lies with President Putin.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also welcome the statement and indeed the additional sanctions that the Minister has announced today. It's absolutely right we do everything we can to resist Russia's attacks on our security and its attempts to suborn our democracy, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, and it's obviously absolutely right that the traitorous former MEP that the Minister mentioned is now in prison. I speak as the member representing Amesbury, the town that Dawn Sturgess was in when she took the fatal poison, represented at the time by my right honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Salisbury, and I also want to acknowledge his leadership throughout these difficult years for Salisbury and Amesbury. It does appear from the report that the NHS did a good job in its immediate response to the medical emergency that Dawn suffered, but it's also apparent that the wider system around that supported the community in Salisbury and Amesbury, the response was somewhat messy, perhaps perfectly understandable reasons. Can the Minister assure us that the government generally is looking at our public safety response in the event of crises like this? And can he tell us what more can be done to ensure that in any future event, local communities are properly supported?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to him for the very sensible and constructive nature of the remarks that he's made today. And of course, I recognise his service as a Wiltshire MP and his obvious constituency interest in this matter. I also genuinely welcome the condemnation of the treachery that we have seen recently, and I'm grateful that he made that point as well. He raised, I think, a very sensible and constructive point with regard to the NHS, and I can give him the assurances that he seeks in terms of the government's attention to these matters. One of the reasons why the Prime Minister took the machinery of government change back in September to ensure that the Security Minister I sit across both the Home Office and the Cabinet Office was to maximise the leverage and coordination across government with regard not only to national security policy, but also with regard to our resilience. And we've recently undertaken, I think, the largest ever resilience exercise across government. So he's right to raise that point. I give him an assurance about the seriousness with which we take these matters. Of course, we will look very carefully at the recommendations in that regard within the report, but I'm grateful to him for the comments he's made today.
Charles.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the number of Russian spies operating in the UK is the highest it's been since the Cold War. Not my words, but the head of counter-terrorism policing. And I welcome the sanctions today on the GRU, but the Security Minister will know that the United Kingdom is probably regarded as Russia's #1 enemy, not the United States, but the United Kingdom. And he will know also there are other agencies operating internationally and have an international footprint, such as the FSB and SVR, whilst noting and recognising, should we say, diplomatic reciprocity and the importance of that. What more can be done, to quote him, have a hard operating environment for both of those agencies? And finally, are other Russian political dissidents safe here in the United Kingdom? And secondly, given the proliferation of chemical weapons, and we know that a chemical agent and a nuclear agent was used in some of the cases outlined today, and given the breakdown in many countries and the security around chemical weapons in those countries, whether in Africa, whether in other parts of the world, how confident is he that the security services are aware of where those chemical weapons might be and where they might be tempted to be deployed?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman, as I always am, for the expertise and experience that he brings to these matters, not least given his very long-standing service on 2 relevant committees in this place. He mentioned CT Police, and let me use that as an opportunity to pay tribute to the work that they do. I have a very good and close working relationship with CT Police. I think that they do extraordinary work. It is a privilege to stand alongside them, and they are exceptional in the work that they do. It is, in part, a symptom of the work that the previous government and this government did to make the UK the hardest possible operating target, that increasingly Russia and other malign states are seeking the use of criminal proxies to do their bidding and their business in the United Kingdom. And there is a lot of work taking place, not only across government, but working very closely with our allies in Europe and further afield to ensure that we are best placed to target malign states using criminal proxies. And the Director General of MI5 referenced that in his recent annual threat lecture. So I give him an assurance that in terms of the point about the UK being a hard target, and he will understand better than most that I'm very limited in terms of what I can say about that, and it would be unwise to give detail that would be helpful to our adversaries. But I give him, again, an assurance of the seriousness with which we take these matters. He raised an important point about dissidents, and again, that's something that I keep under very, very close review, and we make sure that we've got the right and most appropriate mechanisms in place to provide security. His point about chemical weapons was well made. We work very closely with our international allies to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to minimise the risk and the threat. That is not easy work, and there are no guarantees of its success, but I do give an assurance of the seriousness with which we take it, and the approach that we want to undertake is to work closely with our allies.
Dave Dugan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I join the Security Minister in acknowledging the memory of Dawn Sturgess and the sacrifice of Dawn's partner Charlie and Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey and the fearless first responders. In the 7 years since this attack, we've seen an emboldened Putin increase his aggression across Europe. So can the Minister assure the House today that all lessons around this inquiry will be acted on in full? And will the UK Government continue to work with our EU partners in standing up to Putin's aggression in Europe and underscore that it is our multilateral pursuit of and defence of the international rules-based order that is our strength, and it is his isolationist aggression that will forever be his weakness?
I'm grateful for him, for the comments that he's made, and I can give him the assurances that he seeks. As I know that he will acknowledge, the report was published less than a couple of hours ago, but the government will look very carefully at the findings of it. And I give him and the House an assurance that where there is a requirement to act, we won't hesitate to do so. I think his point about EU partners was well made. We value our relationships with our neighbours, with our EU partners, with our Five Eyes colleagues. I recently met with the G7 to discuss these matters as well. We are much stronger in terms of standing against the nature of the threats that we face when we join up with our international partners, and that absolutely is the right approach. In terms of what he said about a rules-based order, I completely agree with that, and I'm sure all members of this House will. That is the right approach. Respecting international law, standing with our allies, that is the best way in which we can defeat Putin.
Julian Lewis.
Has the government formed a view as to why President Putin, the killer in the Kremlin, chose to target Sergei Skripal after he had been pardoned and exchanged? Nothing that I'm saying now derives from my time chairing the Intelligence and Security Committee, but I recall speculation in the press that it was because Mr. Skripal had been actively involved with either the British state or the military, or in some way being, should we say, active in opposing the government of the country from which he had been exchanged. If that is the case, then surely the conclusion in paragraph 818 that the only measures which could have avoided the attack would have been such as to hide him completely with an entirely new identity should indeed have been considered, and it's rather surprising that they weren't. So was Skripal engaged in anything that made him a target?
Minister Jarvis.
Well, the right honourable gentleman knows the very high regard in which I hold him, but he will also understand that he's asked me some important questions, but not necessarily questions that it would be in the interest of our national security for me to get into in any great detail. I can say to him that I have formed a view about the motive that underpins this particular attack, but I'm not going to get into it today. I think and I give him an assurance that we'll look carefully at the point he made about the detail of the report. We will look at that. It was a point raised by the honourable gentleman opposite as well, and we will go very carefully through the detail of all of this report, and I will consider what he said today as well. But I think the conclusion that I draw, which is the conclusion that Lord Hughes has drawn, is that responsibility for this attack lies with the Russian estate. And it is the government's responsibility to ensure, mindful of the nature of the threat that we pose, that we do everything to guard against that threat.
Sarah Ball.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To the extent that he is able, can the Minister please explain what steps he's taken to secure UK commercial ports, given reports more recently of individuals with links to the Russian military entering via these routes?
I think it's an entirely reasonable point that the Honourable Lady has made. I think she will understand that I won't want to get too much into the detail of that. We do look at these matters very carefully. We do work across government and with law enforcement and with the intelligence agencies on it. Again, one of the reasons that I now sit across two government departments is to ensure that our response is coordinated as effectively as possible. She's right to raise it. We're doing everything that we possibly can to counter it.
Final question, Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has referred to the threat that Russia poses to UK national security. A former Irish TD, who was also a Deputy Chief of an Irish Army unit, said if you are looking to affect a Western country with extensive assets and poor security culture, then Ireland is ground zero. It's a playground for them, when he was specifically speaking of Russian intelligence. The Minister has rightly referred to working with EU partners, international partners. Can I seek reassurance that he's also working with the Irish Government and Irish security forces to ensure that the Republic of Ireland doesn't become a soft way in to Northern Ireland and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think that is an entirely reasonable challenge, and I can give him the assurances that he seeks.
That is the end of the statement. I'll give the front benches a moment to shuffle over, and we will have the Select Committee statement shortly. We now come to the Select Committee statement on behalf of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. Tanya and Taniatsi will speak for up to 10 minutes, during which time no interventions may be taken. At the conclusion of her statement, I will call members to ask questions on the subject of the statement. These should be brief questions, not full speeches. Can I emphasise that questions should be directed to the Select Committee Chair and not the relevant Government Minister. Front benchers may take part in questioning, and I call Tanya and Taniatsi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for granting me this opportunity to make this statement. It follows the publication on Monday of our report into the Government's new approach to addressing the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland. Getting the approach right is key to protecting more than 20 years of fragile peace in Northern Ireland, which is a truly remarkable achievement. However, the past still casts a shadow over the present for many people, particularly those who have lost loved ones or are injured or suffered significant trauma during the conflict. Unresolved cases of killing, torture and serious injury can poison relations in the present. Our report is a unanimous, cross-party document. It is the culmination of a year's work, and I am grateful to our committee specialist, Dr Joel Ryan-Hume, and our specialist advisor, Dr Eamon O'Kane, for their diligent and sensitive contribution to that. In December last year, my committee launched an inquiry into the government's then emerging plans. We received almost 80 pieces of written evidence and held 8 evidence sessions with representatives of victims and survivors, veterans, retired police officers and human rights groups. We also heard twice from the Secretary of State. Importantly too, we visited Northern Ireland to hear first-hand from people directly affected by the Troubles. As a cross-party group, we recognise the significance of raising these concerns with a unified voice, and I am deeply appreciative of my colleagues' collaborative spirit in shaping a report built on consensus. This was considered, constructive and consensual work, done at pace to produce a report before the bill returns to the floor of the House for its committee stage. It is our hope the detail contained in it, and which I refer to now, can frame the parameters of debate in this House and beyond across a host of issues. I'll start with the Commission. We found that the current main legacy investigation body, the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, ICIR, has been unable to garner the kind of trust and authority necessary across the communities to carry out its work effectively. It was clear that its roots in the Legacy Act hampered it from the beginning and that fundamental reform was inevitable. There remain, however, several outstanding issues. On investigations, the Government must address the lack of any specific requirement for the investigations process to be ECHR compliant and the de facto exclusion of most Troubles-related sexual crimes from the Commission's remit.
On case referrals, the Government's plans to widen the range of people and organisations who can refer a case to the new Legacy Commission seems sensible. But changes could still be made to the definition of close family member, which would make it more inclusive and reflective of the reality of modern family life. The centralising of appointment powers in the Secretary of State was also raised as an issue, with greater transparency and clear guidance around the appointment processes needed to bolster confidence. And the Government's proposal to reform the Commission's governance and oversight may answer many of the concerns that we heard, but several remain. When it comes to the proposed Victims and Survivors Advisory Group, for example, concerns have been raised about who its members will be and how they will be appointed, and potential duplication of the role performed by the Victims Forum in Northern Ireland. Now to resources. All the reform, goodwill and political impetus in the world will not lead to truth and justice if there is not enough money, either for investigatory or information disclosing bodies. The ICRIR itself has pointed out the increase in demand on its services, something we hope will only continue under the new Commission. And if the Commission is to receive relevant information in a timely manner, the resourcing of organisations such as the PSNI and others with new demands on their records will also need to be considered. Turning to the proposals for inquests. The Government's plans for an enhanced inquisitorial mechanism through the Legacy Commission are seen by some as an improvement on the system produced by the 2023 Act. But concerns persist, including on why judges presiding are to be appointed by ministers rather than through the Northern Ireland Judicial Appointments Commission. Now to veterans. As I said at the outset, we took evidence from veterans' representatives during our inquiry. The Northern Ireland Veterans Commissioner, who we heard from twice, most recently told us the government had been listening to veterans' concerns to an extent. But he added that these are not really protections for veterans, so much as safeguards for all witnesses. Indeed, the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors described them to us at the same hearing as welfare that you would want to afford to anyone involved in the process of engaging with the Legacy Commission. Therefore, we concluded that in packaging these as protections rather than safeguards available to all, the Government risks undermining trust in this process among the very groups, veterans and others, in which it hopes to instil confidence. And we said that the reopening of previously defective investigations should only take place where necessary for the purposes of ECHR compatibility or owing to new evidence. Information disclosure has been and remains one of the most significant issues with legacy policy. The Troubles Bill assigns the Government a new role in balancing information disclosure with national security, something ministers did not undertake under previous legacy measures before the 2023 Act or with Operation Canova, and thus concerns persist about trust, appeal rights and how this provision will operate in practice. On information retrieval, the Government plans to move this to a new independent commission, the ICIR. Again, ministers will need to strike a balance, this time between safeguarding the information provided to the Commission so that individuals have the confidence to engage with it and verifying that information so that the public have confidence in its reports. We also heard that there is a lack of detail on the body's relationship with the Legacy Commission and the extent to which an information firewall will exist between them. With regard to the ICIR and in other areas, the Government of Ireland will also have to play a part. There must be more detail on the Irish Government's timeline for introducing similar structures to those being provided here, and more information on the proposed legacy unit in the Garda. To be clear, throughout our inquiry we heard consistently about the lack of commitment to address legacy in Ireland. We were also told by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission that there has been a lack of compliance in the Republic of Ireland and a lack of commitment to beginning and completing Article 2 investigations. I and some of my committee colleagues met the Irish Government officials on Monday as part of a visit to Dublin, and we were encouraged by the dedication and determination of those involved to establish legacy mechanisms. At this juncture, we urge Dublin to move at pace to show their commitment and mutual good faith and to maximise confidence on the likelihood of successful outcomes. On Monday, we also met with TDs and senators from across the political spectrum. We agreed that the framework, the bill and our report represent an opportunity to take legacy policy forward. And among many of the issues we discussed, we reflected on what it might mean if people from one community hear others in another community say the word sorry. Reconciliation is difficult and cannot be forced on anyone. My committee colleagues and I plan to explore it in more detail next year, but it is clear right now, not least from the brave testimony of victims and survivors during our inquiry, that reconciliation stands a chance of succeeding only if accompanied by people's admissions and acknowledgement of the truth. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, legacy is not only about addressing the past, it is about laying the foundations for a better future. It has been a privilege to lead this vital inquiry, and I am deeply humbled by the courage of those I have met and had the honour to meet. Our committee's report gives the Government the opportunity to pause and reflect on a process that is vital to the future of Northern Ireland. If they do, they will help ensure we can all seize this chance to put the people that matter most, those who lived through the Troubles and still experience its effects today, at the heart of this new approach. And we owe them to get this right, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you.
Mr. Julie Lewis.
I agree entirely with the chairman of the committee that reconciliation depends upon uncovering the truth. Does her committee's report go into the incompatibility of that aim with the reinstatement of trials that the previous Legacy Act would have prevented, given that when people face the prospect of being put on trial, they are less likely rather than more likely to say what actually happened?
With regard to veterans going on trial, we did take evidence and we heard those concerns, and it is reflected in our report. So I would happily have a conversation with the Right Honourable Member to pursue this further, and his expertise in this field is very, very welcome from all members of the committee from across this House. So I thank him.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Honourable Lady for her excellent speech on our very important report on the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland. And I want to acknowledge the committee staff who are sitting in the gallery, Chloe and Joe, who helped put our report together. Madam Speaker, the very clear message from the families, the representatives and the victims to whom I paid tribute that we met across the province was that they want answers, justice and to finally move on. And so with that in mind, can my honourable friend set out how she thinks members of this House can engage more properly and effectively with colleagues in the Oireachtas and the Northern Ireland Assembly to ensure that we give full voice to all those affected by the Troubles?
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for that question. And I think when we were in when we were in Dublin meeting with the Good Friday Agreement Committee and meeting other members, it is imperative for us and for people in this House, members of Parliament who have not spent time in Northern Ireland, that they engage with what life is like for people and the legacy that they are living with. And I would commend him for the efforts that he is making in encouraging the cross-party and the cross-country, collaboration with our counterparts in Dublin, but also in Northern Ireland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I apologise. I've only just seen this report. I wasn't aware it was coming out in the statement, so forgive me if the Honourable Lady's already covered this. But there are two questions emerged from this. One is, one of the biggest criticisms as has passed through the House of Commons and still remains, and I say this as somebody who did serve in Northern Ireland myself, is amongst the veterans is the what appears to be the treatment of veterans and those who committed the atrocities in one and the same way. And this is their real concern, that they're getting mixed up now with the idea of those who started this process and committed the most awful atrocities. The second element is the role of Ireland in this. Their refusal to carry out parallel inquiries, also to play a full part on things like the Omar bombing are big questions that have been asked as well, and I wonder to what degree she thinks the government should address those seriously, because there was a distinct refusal on the front bench of the government to actually deal with that particular last issue in any form.
I thank the right honourable member, and I also respect that he has served in Northern Ireland, as we know many people that have. But the Irish government has pledged to cooperate with the UK public inquiry, but it is clear from what we've heard that victims' families are frustrated with this decision not to commit to its own inquiry on the Omar bombing. But the lack of progress on the Republic of Ireland's inquiry, does remain a profound obstacle to uncovering the truth. But we did hear positive statements when we were in Dublin, and I do have a greater understanding of why, alongside the legacy bill that's going through, the Troubles bill that's going through Parliament now, there may be a misunderstanding, and we urged them as a committee to be more transparent and to be more open with us and with the UK government, so that we do know what they are doing and that they're not hiding anything from us.
And again, I thank my honourable friend for the work that has been done on this report. And building on the question from the honourable gentleman, does the report highlight the importance of making sure that we have ECHR compliant processes in place if we want to ensure that there is a full buy-in from the institutions in the Republic of Ireland in being able to answer the questions that victims and families need them to answer.
I thank my honourable friend for her work and dedication on the committee and her ability to ask the questions that are really ones that need asking. But, we do, the absence of a clear requirement for ECHR compliance is, has been something that has been an issue. So, the fact that we are now moving forward with ECHR compliant investigations is really, really important. And I think those conversations with Dublin and with the Irish government are key. And as I have said to the right honourable member over there on the other side, that is really important moving forward.
Hartledge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the committee for their report and to the honourable lady for her speech earlier. But further to the question from my right honourable friend for Chingford, it is on this very important matter of protections for veterans. It really means a lot to those who served in Northern Ireland. It's important to stress when the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland announced these measures back in September when the House was in recess, he said the protections were specifically for veterans. Subsequently, I asked written questions and he admitted that they were available to all potential participants. So does the Honourable Lady agree that we need absolute clarity on whether these protections are unique to veterans or would actually apply to former paramilitaries?
Well, I think that he makes a good point there, but what we need to do is get that clarification from the Secretary of State. I'm not here to give an opinion, I'm here to be able to present what the findings of our report are. And as it said, it calls it protections. Should it be protections and who are they for? We need the clarity around that.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my honourable colleague who chaired the process diligently in often receipt of very difficult evidence put forward by those who served and also those involved in the reconciliation process. And on our visit to Dublin, it was great to see and understand how much there has been improvement in relations between the UK government and the Irish government, because that is the only way we are going to deliver what the people need us to deliver. But just to take us to the point of reconciliation, the report lays out a path on how what the government must do to ensure that reconciliation is not lost as part of this process, as Part 4 remains the same as it did in the previous bill. Could the Chair just give us a little bit more detail on what she thinks the government needs to do to ensure reconciliation is delivered at the same time?
Well, I'd also like to thank the honourable member for his contribution, and reconciliation is something that has come out that we're not seeing much detail on, but it is something that we are going to look at as a committee. And I would like to commend the government on its much improved relations with the Irish government, and I think that it is testimony to the Secretary of State and his new minister that we are in this position, and I am very grateful to them for that. But we need to make that work moving forward, looking to reconciliation, as the Honourable Member has mentioned.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank my honourable friend, the Chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, for her report. It was a pleasure to serve under her chairship on that committee for the past year. It's a personal sadness that I'm no longer on that committee. The Honourable Lady mentioned that we received evidence as part of that committee that there was a collective loss of confidence and faith in the ICRIR. But I wonder whether she might take the opportunity to make it clear that we also received evidence that there was no loss of personal faith or confidence in the leadership of that organisation. Sir Declan Morgan impressed us all, I think, with his honour, his decency and his candour. He just happened to be leading an organisation that was compromised for the very fact of its birth. And I wonder if she might pick up that point.
Thank you. And I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank you for the service and for your academic... Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thank the Honourable Member.
The Honourable Member for his service on the committee, and also his background in academia really brought a really important part to the committee. On his point, I would like to also say that Sir Declan Morgan really did bring integrity to the Commission, and I would like to thank him personally for what he has done. And it wasn't himself, but the setup of the institution he was leading where we saw the evidence that was failing.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Chair as well for the evidence session, because as this bill now moves to a committee of the whole House, it will be the only opportunity for witnesses actually to come forward and put their testimonies to the bill and the legislation as it stands. The bill as itself actually has 42 amendments and 5 new clauses already tabled, so I think that shows the interest in this bill and what also needs to be done in further work. In regards to the warm words of the Irish Government, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been involved in those conversations for 14 years. I've heard a lot of warm words, but we've never seen anything on paper or in delivery in regards to legacy of what the Irish Government actually does. So can I seek the Chair's reassurance that she will continue to put pressure on her own front bench to bring forward actual product in regards to that? In regard to one specific recommendation from the committee, it said that it was concerned that related sexual crimes from the new Legacy Commission's remit should actually be included in the bill and addressed. In that case, would the Chair support my new amendment, number 4, which actually seeks to do that?
I thank the Honourable Member for his contribution, and I'd like to thank him for the engagement that I have, as he is unfortunately unable to join the committee. And that is a disappointment to me, but that's how procedures work. But I would like to say that I have heard what he says and others have said about the Irish Government's warm words, and I would say that we will, as a committee, continue to have that dialogue and those very frank conversations with them in order, and with our front bench, in order to get the answers that he and others in Northern Ireland require.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I first of all thank the Honourable Lady as Chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee and all those on committee for all that they've done. The Honourable Lady in her last penultimate paragraph referred to, and I quote her, the people who matter the most. The people who matter the most, I believe, Madam Chair, are those who served in uniform, those who died in uniform, who sacrificed for freedom, for liberty and sacrifice. The IRA murderers who have never been made accountable for all the things that have happened. I think on 10th of December, Madam Chair, of 1971, my cousin was murdered. Those who killed him, killed his friend Daniel McCormick, escaped across the border 54 years ago. We're waiting for justice for 54 years, Madam Chair. And we're not the only ones. I could ring them off. I know you wouldn't let me do that, but there's so many who want justice. We want justice. Our families want justice. How will the legacy of the past ensure that those who served this country will get justice and the families will get justice?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to say how well respected the Honourable Member for Strangford is, and those words, I will endeavour to fight for his family and for his loss, and ensure that the committee does everything it can to provide justice and provide the evidence and do what we need to do in order to make that wrong a right.
No doubt the House will join me in also backing that statement that we all value and respect the member for Strangford. Yeah. Right, business continues. Is the front bench shuffling over? If colleagues are exiting, can they do so swiftly or be seated? If you're seated for now, or are you still shuffling? You're still shuffling, I see. So still shuffling and continues. Yes, quite. A presentation of Bill, Chancellor of the Exchequer.
National Insurance Contributions, Employer Pensions Contributions Bill.
Second reading what day?
Monday the 8th of December.
Monday the 8th of December. We now come to the backbench debate on the war in Ukraine. I call Sir Bernard Jenkin, who will speak for around 15 minutes. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motion standing in my name and in the name of many honourable and right honourable members from across the House. And I thank the Backbench Business Committee for providing time for this debate, the first full debate on Ukraine since February this year. And the motion can be summarised very simply as Ukraine must win and can win. And this is because the Russia-Ukraine war was never some regional territorial dispute, as some would like to believe. It has now moved far beyond conventional geopolitics. It is not about territory and cannot be solved by Ukraine ceding territory to Russia. This is because it is an existential clash between competing visions of how global security should be organised and indeed the very nature of our society. This is the result of a long-standing intellectual current within Russia, a mix of imperial nostalgia, nationalist theology, and a deliberate rejection of democracy and the Western rules-based order. Furthermore, this ideological framework isn't fading, it's growing, adapting, and continually finding new ways to justify the unjustifiable, both at home and abroad. Russia's view of a desirable world order is one based on spheres of influence and the right of big countries to impose their will on smaller neighbours. Putin and his henchmen are not politicians, as we would understand. They are intelligence officers and soldiers who have turned the tradecraft of the KGB into the statecraft of the Russian state, in pursuit of building their world order and destroying ours. For this gang of autocrats, an independent Ukraine is not just inconvenient. They cannot tolerate Ukraine's independence because it threatens the very foundations of their own idea of Russian identity. So, their war in Ukraine is only part of a much larger war, in their minds, a war which involves us in the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe, whether we like it or not. Yes, this war is coming to us and has come to us. I'm minded of the words of Leon Trotsky, and I use the word you, Madam Deputy Speaker, advisedly, as I quote, "You might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you," he said. Putin and his henchmen have been saying for a long time that they are at war with us. In the past few weeks alone, expert commentators such as Fiona Hill, Eliza Manningham-Buller, the MI5 former director, and Lord Robertson, the ex-Secretary General of NATO, have all affirmed that Russia, yes, Russia is at war with us. And yes, I mean Russia, not just Putin. This is because Putin's gang of ideologues are skilled at exploiting the resentments of the Russian people in a highly controlled information environment, so that the people accept their lies and so support what they have been told, that Russia is in some fight for Russia's survival against the hostile West. Now, some Western policymakers find this reality unpalatable. They prefer the illusion that Putin might accept some compromise, some deal whereby Ukraine might trade land for peace. But let there be no mistake. This is not just wishful thinking. It is dangerous because it both ignores the motive for Russia to wage this war and denies that Russia has already unleashed war against Europe and the United Kingdom. I give way very briefly, but I've got a lot to say. And
David Burton-Thompson.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's giving a really great speech, and I agree with the honourable gentleman on his points with spy ships through the channels and submarines off the coast of Scotland. Does he agree with me, therefore, that it's vitally important, not only for Ukraine but for the rest of Europe, that we work closely with the coalition of the willing throughout this conflict?
Of course I agree with that, and I will come back to how we work with our allies later. The first thing we must understand is how the character of war has changed. In today's war, everything is a weapon. Disinformation, terrorism, sabotage, assassination, psychological manipulation, malign influence, cyber attacks, economic warfare, menacing undersea cables, even energy, food and fertilizer are used as weapons. And let's not also forget that Russia has weaponized the abduction of Ukrainian children, which is just one of the atrocities which Russia inflicts on the occupied territories. And I'm very sorry that the Honourable Lady for Paisley and Renfrew can't be here, but I hope that her cause is being taken up by someone else in this debate. Make no mistake, we are today already under a sustained assault through a coordinated campaign which merges all these weapons and others, and these attacks are steadily increasing in audacity and seriousness. They are sometimes reported in the press, but often downplayed by wishful governments who are unwilling to acknowledge these attacks for what they are, that they can appear to be isolated acts of espionage or sabotage or diversion, but they are not. They are elements of a systematic, strategic offensive designed to undermine public trust in our governments and our democratic systems, to fragment our societies, to establish groups that destabilise our countries from within, and above all to probe our defences and to find weaknesses to exploit further. This is a test of the resilience of our entire society. And this is hybrid warfare, the grey zone warfare. But the term total war might be more accurate as a description. And total war is the apposite title for a recent book authored by the former member for the Isle of Wight, Bob Seeley. The Baltic and Nordic countries and Poland are currently the main targets, but so is the UK. Indeed, the UK is singled out by Russia as public enemy number one, because Russia sees the UK, quite rightly, as a bulwark against threats and coercion which intimidate some other countries. But grey zone warfare is by no means the only threat the UK faces. Our critical national infrastructure is exposed, particularly offshore. NATO and the UK lack comprehensive air defence. Just this week, Putin said Russia is ready for war with NATO. And we have to be honest when I ask this question: how ready are we? This is also a dangerous narrative taking hold, that Ukraine is losing the war with Russia in Ukraine, and that we must just accept this. This is wholly wrong. There are in fact detailed assessments publicly available which demonstrate that Russia cannot win militarily so long as NATO countries continue to give military and financial support to Ukraine, and economic sanctions against Russia are both maintained and strengthened. I give way to the Honourable Lady and thank her for her support.
Point. I just wondered if the Honourable Member is aware that the Russian state is currently actually taking tanks out of museums to try to get them on the battlefield at the moment. They are that deprived of military equipment.
Yes, that is certainly true, but they're also depending more and more what they produce in their factories rather than their legacy stocks, so that's making the war more and more expensive for them. They're not in an ideal position, and as I will explain, the initial Russian dash for Kiev was disastrous for the Russian army, and the Russians failed from day one to establish air superiority over Ukraine, which is effectively a no-fly zone for Russian military aircraft. Ukraine has succeeded in developing technology and tactics which make Russian attempts to advance extraordinarily costly. Ukraine's ability to strike at Russian military and economic assets deep in Russia is increasing. There is absolutely nothing inevitable about a Russian victory over Ukraine. If we continue to sustain Ukraine and to undermine the Russian economy with sanctions, Russia will be forced to change its calculus for carrying on. Nevertheless, Putin is projecting confidence that he is winning. But let's be clear, this is not because of the military situation, but because of a lack of political will in so many NATO countries. If Putin wins, it is only because we let Putin win. As we let him win in Georgia, as we let him win in the Crimea and the Russian oblasts of eastern Ukraine before he embarked on the attempt to take Kiev, he proved that we are soft. And his confidence is based on his continued belief that nothing has changed. It has often been pointed out that the combined GDP of all NATO is vastly greater than Russia's, so therefore we should have nothing to fear. But that advantage only matters if we have the will to use this economic superiority to defeat Russia's expansionist agenda. War is about nothing if it is not about willpower. Sadly, with a few notable exceptions, like the Baltic states and Poland, we have really yet to demonstrate that willpower to win. This is particularly due to the United States. First, the vacillation of President Biden and his fear of fueling escalation gave Russia time to build up its war machine and to exploit wider alliances. Now, the despicable and disastrous attitude of President Trump seems to offer Putin the opportunity to achieve everything he wants: the subjugation of Ukraine, the humiliation of NATO, the enlargement of the Russian sphere of influence at the expense of European security. Ironically, the effect of the Trump administration's 28-point peace plan has been to encourage Putin to keep the war going. This is because Trump appears ready to give everything he wants to President Putin, that is, Ukraine as a Russian vassal state. There is no incentive at the moment for Putin to stop this war under these circumstances, while the US is seeking to force Ukraine and Europe to accept peace at any price. And it sometimes looks as if European resolve might also crumble. Trump thinks he is the master of the universe, but is in fact being psychologically manipulated by Putin with flattery, and I make no bones about it, with bribes. But something positive in Europe may finally be happening. Despite the tendency of European leaders to focus on differences between them, Merz, Macron, our own Prime Minister, and the leaders of NATO and the EU have shown remarkable unity. There is a realization that a so-called peace agreed on Trump's terms would not be peace at all. Putin will continue his campaign by other means. There will be little or no deterrence to discourage Putin from resuming military action on some bogus pretext at some future date. As Kaja Kallas, the European Union foreign policy chief, has explained, and I quote, "Russia has never truly had to come to terms with its brutal past or to bear the consequences of its actions." And she argued that the nature of the Russian regime means that rewarding aggression will bring more war, not less. And she is right. Putin will come back for more. The democratic world cannot forget the lessons of history. The attitude of some is an eerie parallel of what Chamberlain said about Hitler's annexation of the Czech Sudetenland, which he described, and I quote, "a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." And let this House never forget that Russia signed the 2004 Budapest Memorandum. They prohibit the use of military force in Ukraine. President Putin disregarded this undertaking when he annexed the Crimea and then attacked eastern Ukraine. How many times do we need to learn this lesson? In Putin's world, Russia recognizes no international law, only its own absolute sovereignty. So a Russian signature on any treaty is not to be trusted unless it can be externally guaranteed with people who have the necessary force. Putin is already taunting the UK and NATO with hybrid war attacks. A Russian ship firing lasers at UK military aircraft in neutral airspace would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. This cannot just be ignored. Russia is testing NATO responses and mocking our slow pace to rearm. The consequences of remaining passive would be dire for the credibility of NATO as a deterrent force. Letting Russia have its agenda would also increase Russia's credibility with neutral countries at the expense of NATO and our allies. They will see the EU and NATO as representing waning powers, unable to contain Russia as we did during the Cold War. The agreement on much tougher proposals at Geneva last week, while still engaging Secretary of State Rubio, is a real achievement. The latest news that Putin has again refused to stop the war exposes him as the true aggressor. This is a war that he could so easily stop instantly. So long as Europe and NATO continue to support Ukraine and Ukraine refuses to settle on Russian terms, then Putin will not agree to a ceasefire until he realizes that there is no diplomatic shortcut open to him. The biggest risk we face is that Trump loses interest in his peace effort and withdraws support for Ukraine. But there's already evidence that Trump's power over the Congress is waning. Abandoning Ukraine would split US politics. We must hope that the US would also continue with intelligence support, but we must be ready for that. And Europe should offer to pay for that intelligence, if necessary, if that enables that intelligence support to continue. But settling for a fake peace on unsustainable Trump-Witkoff terms would be far worse. We in Europe have to accept President Trump's actions have demonstrated that he does not care about Ukraine, and his commitment to European security is at best ambiguous. So the right plan is for European NATO to be ready to continue to support Ukrainian resistance to Russia's demands, whatever, to continue to support Ukraine's military, and to help to finance Ukraine's increasingly effective defence industries. That is why the motion refers to the release of the 140 billion Russian frozen assets in Europe, and it is so vitally important. Russia will then continue to suffer the astronomical attrition on men and material and at vast financial cost, and more intensive sanctions must also bite on their economy. In truth, we can kid ourselves about the Russian economy. It remains pretty resilient. But sanctions have reduced foreign exchange earnings by some 20%. They only come from the export of oil and gas. Russia's domestic banks are now the only buyers of Russian government bonds. This is not a long-term sustainable position for Russia. Secondary sanctions applied to the Russian shadow fleet and to countries who enable the shadow fleet to exist have made and can continue to make the export of oil and gas less and less profitable or even loss-making for Russia. But above all, we see the Russian army so slowly advancing in Ukraine, taking tiny areas of land at incredible human cost. We are seeing a land war which Russia cannot win. It has taken all of this year for Russia to take Pokrovsk, a small town, and at the cost of some 100,000 casualties on the Russian side. And they have not, as my right honourable friend briefly intervenes, they have not already taken that town, though they say they have. The US ambassador to NATO pointed out recently that a snail crawling from the Russian border westwards would now be in the middle of Poland had it left at the same time as the beginning of the invasion. That is how badly the Russians are doing militarily. So there is no breakthrough which would give Russia strategic military success. So Putin escalates by ramping up of hybrid warfare on NATO states. He wants to move the focus of the war onto fresh battlefields. He attacks Ukrainian energy infrastructure. He could launch a military attack on a NATO member country using a form of warfare for which that country, unlike Ukraine, is not prepared. Such an attack on an ally would necessitate a response by the UK if deterrence is to remain credible. It might even involve UK troops in Estonia, for example. Our troops are not prepared for this kind of drone warfare that we are seeing in Ukraine. And if they did, what would we do? I leave that question hanging in the air. An attack could involve a missile attack on targets within the UK, for which we are equally unprepared, or on our offshore assets. Our allies in Germany and Poland and Finland take very seriously the real risk that Europe may be drawn into a more military confrontation with Russia, and a lot sooner than is comfortable to acknowledge. So what is it that we must do in the face of this now obvious threat to our security? We must acknowledge and explain. Explain to our population that we are indeed at war now, and we must explain the nature of the hybrid threat. We must call out Russian hybrid attacks for what they are, and we must devise robust responses as well as increasing our own defences. Are these interceptions and no more a sufficient response? We must constantly adapt the use of sanctions, realising that, like any weapon, Russia will devise countermeasures to evade them. We must, as a real priority, increase our military and economic support to Ukraine. However difficult that might be, we need to make it clear, both by our words and our actions, that Russia cannot win this war. And I do say to the Minister who's possible. What plan objective to topple President Putin, but this victory is the only way to prevent Russia discrediting NATO and corroding the confidence that we democracies can and must prevent despots from degrading the global international order. To help achieve peace, we in the UK must accelerate our own war readiness, as the Defence Committee set out in their recent report. The noble Lord Robertson Port Ellen, who oversaw the government's strategic defence review, remarked recently, "We are under attack, prepared," those are his words, that our country is not safe. Changing this does not simply mean strengthening our armed forces, although that is essential. It means adapting a lot of things in our country so that we can survive and fight a war. This will be difficult, even painful, so the sooner we start the better, because it is weakness which encourages Putin. The stronger we are, the less likely we are to be attacked.
The question is as on the order paper, and I call Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Harwich and North Essex for securing debate and making such an eloquent speech. We made all the points that I'm going to make in my speech, but I still will make it, nevertheless. So today is 1,379 days since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And let's not forget, the Ukraine had already been at war with Russia for 8 years. We all remember the rhetoric from the Kremlin, that Kiev would fall in 3 days. Last week, we heard from the former Russian ground force commander, Vladimir Cherkin, who made a rare criticism of the Kremlin from inside Russia, saying that Russia had not been prepared for its invasion of Ukraine. I think it's instructive for the House to quote from him. "We had the traditional underestimation of the opponent and overestimation of our own military. Cherkin said Russia had been buoyed by the confidence from its 5-day war in Georgia in 2008. During the first weeks, we were taught a serious, harsh lesson. The former defence minister tried to find a face-saving exit from the situation, calling what was happening a gesture of goodwill," Cherkin said. He also criticised the entire Russian intelligence community for telling the leadership that which turned out to be entirely false. We know that well over 90% of Ukraine, even in the east and the south and in Crimea, support continued sovereignty of Ukraine. It is one of the first times that a top Russian official had made such public criticism of Russia's war effort, something that not only the attack, but here, unlike in Ukraine, where children under direct threat of death and abduction from Russia are and although our buildings are not under immediate tested by reconnaissance and dummy drones to test our readiness for a full-scale war. I've been to Ukraine 7 times since the full-scale invasion, and not just to Kiev or Lviv. I've travelled this great country in their time of greatest need, visiting Vinnytsia, Zhytomyr, Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson Oblast, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, and my own sister city of Kharkiv, which has had a relationship with Leeds since not long after the full-scale invasion. I've seen firsthand the strength, courage and determination of Ukraine and the commitment to Ukrainian culture, language and identity. And I know that they will never, never allow their identity to be subsumed by Russia, which is why the practice of stealing Ukrainian children by Russia, crucifying them, and then, when of age, sending them back to Ukraine to fight for Russia is so abhorrent. The worst, most dystopian war crime one can imagine. And we need to ensure they are prosecuting the International Criminal Court for this. And I'd also like to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire South, for the amazing work she's doing leading the APPG on this matter. There is so much that we can say about the needs of Ukraine. I do not think we should use this debate to provide a running commentary on the war, or on the stalled peace talks, which Russia have disingenuously used to try and pursue their original war goals. I do want to talk about what can turn the dial. As we all know, only maximum pressure on Russia and placing Ukraine in the strongest possible position will create a scenario where a ceasefire can be agreed. The twin approach of using Russian state assets for military aid and squeezing the Russian economy through the strongest possible sanctions regime may create those conditions and certainly put Ukraine in a much stronger position than they are now. We all know what assets are clear, and we need those assets to be seized and repurposed for the self-defence of Ukraine. Euroclear has been holding about 200 euros belonging to Russia's central bank, the majority of an estimated 260 billion in sovereign Russian assets held in the West. My view is that the full seizure of Russian assets is clearly proportional to the crimes committed by the Russian state against Ukraine, and any post-war settlement will incur huge reparations, so the seizure of assets are paying forward a long tradition of post-war reparations. I welcome the news yesterday that the European Commission plans to move forward quickly with the reparation loans to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets, or an EU loan based on common borrowing, with a figure of 90 billion euros being reported, which is very significant. The second option is due to some reservations by the Belgian government, who host Euroclear in Brussels. I welcome the Ursula von der Leyen statement that Ukraine needs to defend itself and take forward peace negotiations from a position of strength. I'm sure something that we in the entire House agree with. Publicly available information indicates the United Kingdom has frozen private Russian assets belonging to sanctioned individuals amounting to £28 billion. But could the Minister indicate the total value of sovereign state assets currently frozen in the United Kingdom and say where the government is prepared to allocate immediately those funds which are not subject to the approval of international partners, Euroclear assets, to support Ukraine during this very difficult time? Of course.
Quite interesting about this with the UK government, the Foreign Office particularly, is that the pressure that we've all mounted on them to seize these assets and use the capital value, most of them are in cash now anyway, but the answer has been refusal. I understand their nervousness about market instability as a result, but what they've also done now is said they can use the earnings, the interest from the loan, from the capital. You cannot own the interest if you don't own the capital. So we're dancing on ahead of a pin. Wouldn't it be better if they were clear and seized the capital once and for all, regularize the use of that money one way or another?
Absolutely agree with the Honourable. And I actually think it's not just that profits or the interest from the assets that are held here should be repurposed, but actually we should look at how those assets are being managed and maximise that for the purpose of Ukraine as well. But to conclude my question to the Minister, to ask if the United Kingdom will be part of the reparation loan to Ukraine scheme alongside if that comes about. In terms of assets, I'll keep it brief. Keep it brief as I spoke